The Death Mage Who Doesn't Want a Fourth Time. Chapter 36. Spartan Training Supported with Praise. The most peaceful, prosperous age that the world of Lambda ever experienced, the Age of Gods. The ones who ended it were the Demon King Gududanis and the countless evil gods that followed him. The one who cursed the water, earth, and even the air, turning them into poison that ruined living creatures. The evil god of cursed poison. The master of massacre, who knew of nothing but hunting and competing. The one who taught the people the pleasure of drawing blood. The evil god of mad slaughter. The one who toyed with all life forms, the ones who created numerous evil synthetic beasts, the god of distortion, the one who corrupted the people with immoralities that had never existed in Lambda before, the god of ruinous greed. Their leader was destroyed by the gods and the champions, but there are still many evil gods lurking in this world. One of those, the evil god of distortion, had a subordinate god, Hihiryushukaka, the god of joyful life. There was a vampire community obeying this evil god and receiving his divine protection. Hihiryushukaka was an evil god who taught his followers that toying with life was the ultimate pleasure, a way of proving oneself to be a superior being. If someone begs for their life, toy with them, give them hope, and force them to obey, before finally pushing them off the cliff of despair and taking their life. If there are insects who desire power, give them a power they do not want that leads them to ruin, and make them scream in regret that they do not need power. If someone is proud of their strength, rob them of that strength, tear off their limbs, crush their eyes, and rip out their tongues. Make them into nothing more than insects that are only capable of crawling on the ground. Only by doing that can you become superior beings. Only by creating a pile of the weak beneath your feet and trampling over it can you reach such a high place. The vampires had lost Vida, their goddess of life and love. For Hihiryushukaka, who advocated such teachings, converting them into his followers may have been one of those pleasures for him as well. 100,000 years later, those who followed the evil god of joyful life were a prominent force even among the other vampires who had begun to follow the evil gods. There were over 100 noble-born vampires, ruled by 3 purebreeds who possessed tremendous power. Below them were countless subordinate vampires and human followers who desired eternal life. If one included the undead, monsters, and even the groups of mercenaries and bandits who were not even aware that they were serving as vampires' pawns, it would be foolish to try and count their numbers. Their military strength was equivalent to that of a large country, and their influence was so great they would be able to manipulate such large countries. Now then, the first topic of discussion is the aforementioned Dampier. The one speaking was Berkine, one of the 3 purebred vampires ruling the community. His outward appearance was that of a man around 20 years of age, with delicate features consisting of thin lines. He seemed like someone who might gather sons and daughters of noble families to host tea parties and balls. Dampier. Ah, the one who was born between one of your subordinates and one of the guards. The one who replied was a woman who looked to be over 20 years old. Her attractive figure and beautiful face would be enough to conquer any man if she smiled, but they were clouded by a somewhat dull-looking gaze. A dress that revealed much of her chest and left her back exposed was extravagant, but in bad taste. Rather than looking like a noble lady, she looked like a high-class prostitute that noble families might pay for. Both the mother and child are working hard in my castle, with their backs stuck together, moving around with 8 limbs. Ternesia, isn't that from 100 years ago? Asked Berkine. Then what are you talking about? The one that came from the stomach of that beast person? Didn't you kill that one, along with its whole clan? That one was from 500 years ago. Ternesia, the one engaging in this 2-person comedy act with Berkine, was another one of the pure-breed vampires. She was the 3rd most powerful in this community, and recognized as the most powerful female vampire. The Dhampir I am referring to is the one born at Gubamon's place, between one of the subordinates in a very low position and a dark elf. Ah, the one at Gubamon Jisan's place. Now that you mention it, something like that did happen there, didn't it? So, where is Gubamon Jisan? I don't see him around. Berkine and Ternesia spoke a third name, Gubamon. He was the last of the pure-breed vampires ruling the community. But even though Ternesia looked for him, she couldn't see him at all. Lord Gubamon is absent today because he is busy with other matters. The pale-faced, noble-born vampire who had spoken was likely one of Gubamon's followers. He was trembling violently, unable to endure Ternesia's glare. What did you say? He's absent today as well? I'm only absent for 9 out of 10 meetings, but that G-san has already missed 20. Hurry up and bring that shitty old man out here. Please, forgive me. Lord Gubamon is dealing with some matters at hand, and he asked me to apologize to you on his behalf, Ternesia-sama and Berkine-sama. Stop making excuses! Do you want to turn into materials for one of my creations? Ternesia looked as if she would pierce the trembling noble-born vampire with her fangs at any moment. Berkine and the other noble-born vampires chuckled at this scene. Even their own brethren didn't deserve their compassion. Let us leave it at that. We already have received a report on the details, you see, said Berkine. Unlike subordinate vampires, creating noble-born vampires took a considerable amount of effort. And though it was very pleasant to see disputes between Gubamon's faction and Ternesius' faction, it could cause the community to disintegrate. Berkine enjoyed the spectacle for a little while putting a stop to it. Is that so? Asked Ternesia. Yes. As you know, Valen was executed by one of Gubamon's subordinates. The body was disposed of in a way that it will never come back to life. And I have heard that the religious fanatics in Amid were used to burn the dark elf mother at the stake, said Berkine. Wow. Considering that shitty old man has nothing in his head except filling up his collection, his subordinates perform pretty well, don't they? So, what happened to the Dhampir? Asked Ternesia. Apparently, he managed to slip away, said Berkine. Huh? As Ternesia's face twisted in surprise, Berkine raised a corner of his mouth and continued his explanation with a pleased look on his face. He was never found, but as he was still a baby of breastfeeding age, it was thought that he would be unable to survive on his own and was left alone. I do not know how he did this, but as the child, not even 3 years of age, he apparently gathered several hundred ghouls under his control. And when the humans dispatched a large extermination force after him, he apparently led the ghouls across the Boundary Mountain Range before the extermination force could reach him. What he did and how he did it is a complete mystery. As Berkheim spoke, not only Ternesia, but all of the other vampires showed all sorts of reactions. There were some who were half laughing, thinking this was some kind of joke. Others were silently dumbfounded. Others still were confused, wondering if they had misheard something. "You have got to be kidding me," hissed Ternesia. The only one to respond with anger was Ternesia. "So you're saying that someone let him go, thinking he would die, then helplessly watched as this Dampier gathered hundreds of followers and crossed the Boundary Mountain Range? What the hell was he thinking? No, does he even have brains to think with in the first place? Kill that guy right now." Ternesia bared her fangs in anger. She wasn't scared of the Dampier. She simply understood that the vampires had ruled the world in the shadows for 100,000 years because of the evil god's divine protection, and because they had prepared their battles in a way that they would win before even fighting them. She wouldn't feel this sense of danger facing a mere Dampier or human. However, there were pure-breed vampires residing beyond the Boundary Mountain Range, beings that stood equal to themselves. They had shown almost no movement at all during the last 100,000 years. But if they were to begin moving, it was certain that the vampire community here would have its existence endangered. "She is right, Berkheim-sama. Please, execute the one responsible immediately and leave the Dampier to us," said one vampire. "No, leave this to me, please, Carmine," said another vampire. "I will do my best to live up to your expectations, Berkheim-sama and Ternesia-sama," said yet another vampire. And then the vampires, seeing this as an opportunity to add some achievements to their own records, raised their hands one by one, even though nobody had asked them to. It was impossible for a noble-born vampire to become a pure-breed vampire through achievements, but if Hihi-Ryushukaka acknowledged them, they would receive his divine protection. If they received this divine protection, they would rise 1 or 2 steps above the other noble-born vampires in power and privilege. No, I am thinking of still making the person who failed work to deal with the matter," said Berkheim. "What? Are you saying that you're taking pity on someone who has failed twice already? It's certain that he'll just fail a third time." "Well, I think so as well, but I was impressed by his enthusiasm. Ah, yes, let me introduce him to everyone," said Berkheim. At these words, Berkheim gently raised his thin white hand. With a whooshing sound, a man with his whole body covered in blood fell down from somewhere. "Allow me to introduce you. This is Gubamon's subordinate, Sekrent Ozbakun," said Berkheim. With a smile, Berkheim raised his hand to introduce this man, the noble-born vampire who held connections to Earl Thomas Palpapek, currently letting out a small groan. His appearance could be summed up in one word: ghastly. All of the fingers on both of his hands had been pierced through by silver skewers. His legs were covered in burn marks, as if he had been roasted in a fire, and the flesh on his back was covered in countless protuberances. One of the protuberances appeared to burst. A mouse with no skin or fur crawled out from within and began to eat into Circeant's nearby flesh. And then, once it had eaten a quantity of flesh equivalent to the size of its own body, it pushed its head into the hole it created and returned beneath Circeant's skin. This was one of Hihi-Ryushukaka's curses. "Forgive me. This I will definitely." As Circeant mustered his strength and looked up, the vampires looking at him gasped. He had no face. His eyes had been gouged out, his nose sliced off, his cheeks dug out, and his lips torn to pieces. His head was like a skull that was covered in blood. The cruelest thing about all of this was none of the things that had been inflicted upon him, including the curse, were fatal. Noble-born vampires possessed incredible vitality and regenerative capabilities. They would not die even after having this done to them. Even the noble-born vampires who had transcended the limits of mortality were nothing but playthings for Berkheim. As they were reminded of this fact, the other vampires fell silent. The mice that were made of flesh continued consuming Circeant's tissues as they regenerated. Turnisia rose from her seat, approached him, and kicked him in the face with all of her strength. "Ugh! Berkheim, what are you planning on having this half-dead bastard do? He wouldn't even be able to kill a single caterpillar." Circeant was in agony after his jaw was crushed by Turnisia's kick. Indeed, he looked more like a pitiful criminal on death row awaiting execution than an assassin. "With all due respect, I would say that Turnisia-sama is right. I believe it would be impossible for this person to cross the boundary mountain range, find the target, get through hundreds of ghouls, and dispose of the vampire." This remark was made by a female vampire who shared Turnisia's opinion. The other vampires seemed to be in agreement as well. Though differences existed between individuals, vampires were a powerful race. If one were to only look at the pure breeds, it would not be an exaggeration to say they were the strongest among all the races that Vita had created. They could slaughter dragons with ease. One pure breed vampire could destroy an entire nation on his own. The only ones capable of opposing them would be a party of adventurers of A class or higher, equipped with legendary class magic items. However, Circeant was a noble-born vampire, a being considerably inferior to a pure breed. Even so, he would be a great threat to knights or adventurers, but there would be plenty of monsters on his level of strength in the Boundary Mountain Range. Anyone trying to cross the Boundary Mountain Range high in the sky would encounter the monsters inhabiting the devil's nests in the skies. The devil's skies. They would be considered as challengers to the fight for dominion over the air and be torn to pieces. But crawling across the steep mountain surface like a human would take time, and there were still no guarantees that one would make it through that journey safely. Monsters were overflowing from the unknown devil's nests and unexplored dungeons. They would attempt to devour any outsiders. In order to avoid that, hundreds of warriors strong enough to ignore monsters and capable of fighting while climbing the steep cliffs would need to be gathered, and they would have to travel in a large group while intimidating the surrounding monsters to deter them from attacking. No matter how one thought about it, it was impossible. Unless a god and his followers were to act directly, or some incredible trick was used, this could not be done. Not only would Serkrant have to cross the mountain range, but he would have to follow the Dampier's tracks, slip through the sights of hundreds of ghouls that had survived the journey, and kill the Dampier. If Serkrant could at least complete that mission, the vampires here couldn't care less whether he lived or died, but it would be problematic if he were to die before completing it. There is no problem. Serkrant-kun said that he could go as far as risking his own life to complete the mission. Isn't that right, Serkrant-kun? Asked Berkheim. Yes, left hurt to me. Serkrant immediately responded to Berkheim's question with his shredded tongue and crushed jaw. The other vampires were secretly amazed that he was still capable of hearing despite having no ears. I don't give a shit about his willpower or motivation. What I'm trying to say is that I can't trust his ability, Ternisia said. What you are saying is completely reasonable, Ternisia. That is why I am thinking of dispatching one of my lovers for this, said Berkheim. Huh? One of your prostitutes? The vampires began to murmur. Their faces expressed uncontrollable fear and disgust. Vampires were generally very proud. They would never make an effort to raise someone of the same rank above themselves. The reason subordinate and noble-born vampires formed a hierarchy was because the ones at the bottom of the hierarchy would be treated as slaves. At least, this was true for the vampires who had come to follow the evil gods. And Berkheim greatly enjoyed watching this hierarchical process. It was a hobby to him. Even things like torture were nothing but casual pastimes compared to this. The noble-born and subordinate vampires that he had turned into his subordinates, he would make them compete and fight amongst each other. He would make them crush each other and draw each other's blood, granting his favor to the victorious and bestowing severe punishments to the defeated. He was saying that he would have one of his lovers, one of his own bodyguards, work with Serkrant. Eleonora, you will do this for me, won't you? A beautiful woman with red hair that came down to her waist appeared from within Berkheim's shadow. If she were to appear at a ball, noblemen experienced in giving compliments would exhaust their vocabulary to praise her beauty from the depths of their hearts. She was wearing a smile that would instantly make any man fall in love with her. Yes, please, leave it to me, said Eleonora. Make sure you get along with Serkrant-kun and the others. Also, the ruins of Talosheim are nearby, so it would be very helpful for you to collect the bones of the Sword King Borkus, if they are still around. That would allow me to have Guboman owe me a second favor, said Berkheim. Certainly, my beloved lord, said Eleonora. Eleonora, while she was the youngest among Berkheim's subordinates, having only become a noble-born vampire several years ago, she was a talented woman who had established herself as one of the best. It was expected that in a few hundred years' time she would become one of the most powerful followers of the evil god of joyful life, other than the pure-breed vampires themselves. Even Tunisia had killed several of her own subordinates out of irritation at the fact that they would never reach her level. Be careful and do not let your guard down and go through a painful experience. It would be even better if Eleonora and the Dampier simply killed each other. As Ternisia spoke these words that concealed her true feelings, the discussion regarding this topic came to an end. What came afterwards was a regular meeting with the same contents as usual. How the guilds hiding in the shadows were doing, the recent movements of the Omedes Church, how the conflict to become the heir of the Hartner family of earls was intensifying, the exchange of information that would help the vampires pass the time during the long nights, reports on the status of various projects. Finally, candidates to become subordinate vampires were introduced. Once they were acknowledged, they underwent the process to transform into vampires, and then the meeting was adjourned. There were 4 dungeons in the Devil's Nest surrounding Talosheim. They were Garon's Valley, Doran's Aquatic Cavern, Borkus's Subdragon Savanna, and Barigan's Fall Life Mountain. All of them were dungeons that imitated natural environments, but the materials obtained from these dungeons had supported Talosheim's prosperity. Vandaloo had decided to clear the one with the lowest difficulty among them, the D-class dungeon, Garon's Valley. It would likely be about as difficult as the dungeon he had entered in the Merg Shield Nation, or so Vandaloo thought, but this had been a training ground for Talosheim's inexperienced adventurers, and one of the sources of Talosheim's prosperity. Garon's Valley was a place where rock salt and stone could be obtained. The rock salt in particular had been particularly important, since Talosheim was located in an inland area surrounded by a mountain range. It would not have developed into anything more than a small village without this salt. Vandaloo was currently on the first floor of Garon's Valley. The members with him were the usual cast, with the exception of Bastia having replaced Sam. He was fighting one-on-one against a goblin soldier armed with a short spear. Though the goblin's movements were poor in Bastia's eyes, it did have some degree of technique as it thrust its spear towards Vandaloo repeatedly. Vandaloo used martial arts with some degree of technique to repel the thrusts, and tried to counterattack with his claws. His attack was dodged, and the spear was thrust towards him again. This crude exchange continued, though it was suspenseful to watch if one remembered that it was a battle between a 3-year-old child and a monster. If one thought of it as a warrior fighting another, it would be yawn-inducing. There were dozens of goblin soldier corpses all around them. The one who had done this was not Vandaloo, but Bone Man, Bastia, and the others. They had slaughtered an entire group of goblin soldiers, except one, to allow Vandaloo to take it on.
"How is Bochan's talent for unarmed combat?"
As Saria asked Bastia this question while wiping the blood from her halberd, Bastia replied, "I don't know how to put it. I've said this to Van before, but he has an aptitude for this, so much that it makes me excited. But I feel like it would be wrong to call it talent."
So does that mean that he does not have any talent? He has better memory than me, so he will probably surpass me soon, won't he, Nason?
Saria thought hard about Bastia's words. As Rita said, it seemed to her that Vandaloo had a good memory. They were now undead living high-leg armor and a living bikini armor. But while they were alive, they had been maids, and though they used a broom for cleaning, they had never wielded halberds or naginatas, or shot monsters to death with bows and arrows. Thus, they were reliant on the increased attribute values that they had obtained from being monsters to wield their weapons. They had received instructions of Vigaro, who had told them that their movements were those of beginners, and they had made use of the fact that undead had no need for rest or sleep to train all night, every night. Through this, they had finally learned their skills. To them, Vandaloo seemed to be quick to learn things in comparison. He slept at night, and every week on his day off he only did 1 hour of practice. Vandaloo was receiving the goblin soldiers' counterattacks and suffered injuries, but it could not be helped. Unlike Saria and Rita, who were suits of armor, Vandaloo had a flesh body. Van has no hesitation, no fear, and he doesn't seem to be impatient at the moment, said Bastia.
Choo!
Is that not a good thing? Bone Man was examining a goblin's corpse with the tip of his sword to see if a magic stone might come out. In response to his question, Bastia replied, You're right. It is a good thing. Vigaro got angry with me plenty of times back in the day. He would tell me not to close my eyes, not to be scared, not to get impatient. Bastia recalled calmly the times when she was still an amateur. She was now a rank 4 ghoul warrior, but, of course, that didn't mean that she had been strong right from the beginning. Because she had grown up in a dangerous devil's nest, she had gone through and overcome harsh training. Ghouls had no military exercises or anything of the sort. Instead, they had used Spartan-style training that emphasized practical experience, making the inexperienced fight the weak monsters such as goblins that had been captured alive. But even so, real battles and training are different things. When someone is facing an opponent that really intends to kill them, they wonder if this attack will be enough. What could happen if the attack is dodged? And this causes them to hesitate. Exposed to the bloodthirst-filled gaze and attacks of their enemies, they fear being wounded or killed. Unable to display their ability to read battle as they do in training, they become impatient.
Is that how it was?
Asked Saria.
I might get the impatient part,
Said Rita.
Yeah, I don't know about the hesitation or fear, but I understand the impatience part,
Said Saria. It seemed that the undead did not have much sympathy for that, however. Their senses were different from those of living creatures, so that was to be expected. But Van doesn't have any of those, said Bastia. Vandaloo attacked with no hesitation, receiving attacks with no fear of pain, and counterattacked patiently. Bastia had asked him whether he was simply covering it up with his expressionlessness, but it seemed that he really felt no hesitation or anything else.
The worst that can happen to me is being injured. I won't die from something like that anyway.
Vandaloo had the danger sense death spell constantly active, so he could sense how likely it was that he would die. The bloodthirst of his enemies was just another danger. It seemed that he was also able to ignore pain. He wasn't dulling his senses, but rather delaying them. I've experienced far more painful things in my previous life. It seemed that he learned a way to divert his attention from pain in his previous life. This was further supported by the high-speed regeneration ability he possessed as a Dampier and the no-attribute spell, Healing Power Enhancement. And because he knew that he would simply feel a little pain even if he failed, he felt no impatience. Even if his fingers or legs were cut off, he would simply need to pick them up and reattach them. That would be problematic for his eyes, so he would be careful about those. That's why he does things like that. As Bastia said this, the goblin soldier's short spear pierced Vandaloo's arm.
Ah!
Said Saria.
Bochan!
Said Rita. Grrr, said Bone Wolf. Rita and the others panicked, but Vandaloo remained composed. That was only to be expected. He had used his arm as a shield against an attack he decided that he could not avoid. The goblin soldier smiled and tried to pull his spear out, but that was the cause of his downfall. Phuh! With strength that seemed impossible for a 3-year-old body, Vandaloo moved his arm that still had the spear piercing it and broke the goblin soldier's stance. And then, as the goblin soldier fell forward, he dug out the goblin soldier's side with his claws. With blood spurting from its wounds and its mouth, the goblin soldier became yet another corpse on the ground. A failure. With these words, Vandaloo pulled the spear out of his arm, cast sterilization, and healed the wound.
That wasn't a failure. What would we do if you were to die?
Asked Saria.
If I recall, humans die if they lose too much blood, don't they?
Demanded Rita.
Gah-ha! Gah-ha!
Screamed Bonebird.
Calm down, I'm not going to die. Sorry.
Vandaloo apologized, trying to calm Saria and the others down. This was why Bastia was kept on her toes when watching him, and it was difficult to get angry at him as well.
I'm sorry. I couldn't complete my attacks, and I lost my footing because I tripped over one of the corpses on the ground, so I couldn't avoid my enemy's attack. I used my arm as a shield to avoid a more serious wound. Next time, I will use my claws to deflect the spear or defeat my enemy before such a thing can happen.
For Vandaloo, using his arm as a shield was an action he took to avoid the worst possible outcome, something that couldn't be helped. But even so, he knew that it wasn't pleasant for those close to him to see, and if he was scolded harshly, he would fall into a panicked state. Good. Make sure to be more careful next time. And so, after Bastia said those words, she settled on teaching him what he should have done in that situation. Vandaloo was aware of his own lack of ability, so once he gained the skills that he was lacking, he would no longer need to do such reckless things. Bastia thought this, as did Vigaro and Zadiris, who heard about these things from her. Nobody allowed their own bodies to be wounded because they enjoyed it. Even Vandaloo felt the sensation of pain. If there was a way to survive and win without being wounded, he would definitely choose a method that allowed him to avoid pain. In fact, Zadiris and Vigaro were stronger than him and had fought through battles and had been forced to do absurd, rash things to somehow survive. Zadiris in particular had pushed herself like that only to be rescued by Vandaloo. So, Van, I'm going to have you raise your skill quickly. After a short rest, we're moving on to the next. So, Vandaloo would have to learn some proper skills while they were still on a floor where he could get away with pushing himself. Isn't the pace a little fast? It's not. Then am I allowed to use magic? You want to get stronger, don't you? Do your best, Van. At the very least, can I do a normal ambush or surprise attack instead of facing them head on? You won't learn techniques if you do it like that, right? You have to fight. It wouldn't make for good training for Vandaloo if he were to use magic, and Vandaloo was not yet skilled enough to combine both magic and martial arts while fighting. Making use of his high attribute values, he would be able to kill a goblin soldier in one hit with a surprise attack, but then he wouldn't learn the essential skills he needed. And above all, men needed to be strong. I heard from Kachia that wives raise not only their children but their husbands as well. Rest assured, Van, I'm going to raise you well. Yay! Vandaloo was the one who had asked her to teach him unarmed combat because he wanted to be stronger, and he knew that his almost real combat training was an efficient way to learn. It's all right, Van, you can do it. Yes. And more importantly, Vandaloo was the type of person that was easily affected by praise. And so on this day, Vandaloo defeated 2 goblin soldiers, 1 kobold, 2 mini needle wolves, and a goblin knight, all on his own. You have acquired the unarmed fighting skill.